Well, now that place in Africa identified as Negro land suddenly makes sense. Apparently, the entities that were expelled from Portugal and Spain were of a darker hue, also identified as Negro. That, of course, is not an English word, that is coming from a Latin root, and of course, that means black. Not only were these entities identified as Negro, these entities were also identified as Mauritanian. And so that name Morano is not just a name to indicate an expelled entity or a converso. This name indicates that the Moranos were the same as the Moriscos, and that is why their ancestry is so entangled and why it's almost impossible to disentangle. And so apparently, what is going on is that there was a collective of people, these Berbers, that did the invasion. And the distinction with respect to the Berbers was a distinction along religious lines. However, this did not mean that in terms of ethnicity that these were different people. And this would explain why they were traveling together, why they were conquering together, why they were invading together. They were essentially the same people with Abrahamic roots. We're going to look at this Morisco word, this Morano construct, so that we can see how this all fits together. Now let's get back to this narrative that we have been given over time related to the Marano or the Moreno. What we see here in Oxford Languages is that this word is supposed to be related to medieval Spain, and these entities were identified as Christianized Jews, or interestingly, we see here, or Moor. And so a Moreno was either a Jew or a Moor. And what we find out here is that a Moreno is a Jew and a Moor based upon this particular collective. It also goes on to indicate that this particularly refers to those who professed conversion in order to avoid persecution. And of course, you know, according to the historical narrative, that many of these people were executed during the Inquisition. And of course, many of them were expelled and sent to the west coast of Africa and some of these Atlantic islands. Now, common sense indicates that if these entities or many of these entities could just blend in on the west coast of Africa, that perhaps in terms of phenotype, they resembled someone on the west coast of Africa. This might also explain this sudden appearance of all of these entities on the west coast of Africa with these extreme ties to Europe. So much so that in some areas there were entities back in Europe on thrones serving as godparents of entities that were in Africa. Now, of course, this doesn't make complete sense at first blush. However, when looking at this is starting to make a little bit more sense because a number of people in Europe and a number of people coming out of Europe have this syndrome that is related to this film that came out a while ago known as Imitation of Life, where this entity, Sarah Jane, pretended that her dark brown mother was not her mother as she passed for something else. And so that's what we've got going on with a number of these entities with brown hair, entities with brown eyes, entities with curly hair. These entities got those phenotype dynamics from somewhere. However, there is a need to create these caste systems related to phenotype, and so therefore many people are fond of denying their own ancestors. But let's carry on here. This also perhaps sheds a little light on the involvement of specific Portuguese and Spanish entities and African entities in the transatlantic slave trade as transporters and enslavers of individuals. And so this brings Abraham into the transatlantic slave trade in a way that varies from the general narrative that we have been given about this Abrahamic involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. And so here we see perhaps evidence of or suggestion of involvement in both being enslaved and also running the slave trades. This would be a confederacy between Europe, North Africa, and West Africa, and those who were in the colonies in the Americas. This might also be a part of the whole one drop rule dynamic that has taken place. I want to also point out that many people who are darker brown, medium brown, they also pretend not to have lighter ancestors who would be typically considered European. And so there are a number of people walking around with all of these fictions in their heads and living out these fictions in reality about who their ancestors are, talking about their melanin is popping and all of that. And in fact, when you dig far enough down into that ancestry, you see that there's a little less melanin in there than you would be expecting based upon all of this bragging about melanin popping. However, let's continue on here. So we have here in Merriam-Webster, Moreno again, and it indicates a Christianized Jew of medieval Spain. Of course, we see now that this is not telling the whole story. Now, what was noteworthy about this also was this term Moreno referred to the word pig in Spanish. And so this entity, this converso, whether we're talking about a Jew or a Moor, was being referred to in Spanish as a pig. Now, it's unclear about whether this was really going on, but this is what is offered, and its first known usage is indicated here as 1561. Now, this is interesting because the narrative is that many of these entities were on these boats sailing related to Columbus. And so that construct appears to have been used prior to that, but this is what we have here. And so here we see Moreno with the Marrano, so this Marrano, again coming out of Spain. It's when we start to notice these spelling variations that the Mauritanian identity starts to emerge. And so here you see with these spelling variations for this family name, Maranon, Marano, Marano with two R's or with one R. And it also indicates there are other transliterations. Of course there are. And of course, all of this would explain how many of them got caught up in the transatlantic slave trade, where they were brought to different places in the Americas with a different identity. So we see here with this Murano with the one R that this is emerging from both Italy and Spain. And it is here with these spelling variations for Murano that you see the Mauritanian identity emerge. And it indicates here that these spelling variations include Murano with one R, Maranto with the T, Marano, and this is when you start to see that more in there very clearly, Maurano, and then Mauritano. Now, at first, we see this Mauritano surname emerging out of Italy. However, there's a little bit more going on with respect to this Mauritano name. And here you see a similar dynamic with respect to the spelling variations of Mauritano. And you see the Marano with one R. You see Maranto, Marano with the Maurano, and then, of course, Mauritano again, and Marengo. And even if you search for Mauritano, you see that some of the things that pop up are the Mauritanian. And so, with respect to coming into the Americas, in the mainland area, it's perhaps the case that entities that were darker brown were just basically classified as Negro, and the rest of the identity cut off. And entities that went to the west coast of Africa or different islands might have continued to maintain this identity. But with respect to this situation and the situation with American Indians, there was definitely an effort to what is known as lighten the line. And so, with respect to lightening the line, it appears that perhaps lightening the line would result in one being able to claim this Abrahamic identity or this American Indian identity. And if one's line was darkened, then they suddenly were no longer of these family lines. Now, of course, this is very weird because this means that family members were involved in this dynamic. And you do see this with these purported civilized tribes. You see many of them basically excommunicating historically family members related to allotments and receiving resources from the government. And so the nations that have been created are not organic nations. They are more like countries that have been created, or corporate entities that have been created, but they defy the laws of nature in terms of families and how you identify families and how inheritance actually works, not just property inheritance, but genetic inheritance. And so there's been a lot of odd dynamics going on with respect to that. But let's carry on here. You can see here with this direct translation that Mauritano is identified as a Spanish word. It's Spanish detected. And when translated into the English, it translates as Mauritanian. And so Morisco, Marano, all of that is Mauritanian. And here you can see a bit more information about this. This Mauritano basically refers to someone who is a native of Mauritania, indigenous to Mauritania, Mauritano. And here you see it also refers to this Mauritanian, meaning relating to or characteristic of Mauritania, a native or inhabitant of Mauritania. Now, some people might offer that the entities, these Moranos and these Moriscos, were inhabitants of Mauritania, but not necessarily indigenous to Mauritania. However, that is probably not the case. It is probably the case that the Spanish were identifying them as related to Mauritania. Now, when looking at this etymology deconstruction, we see this Mauritania is coming from Mauritanus. It's just like that, Mauritano. Mauritanian meaning one of the Moors, and the IA ending indicating a country. The first element is from Marus or Moor, from the ancient Greek. Marus, again with the MAUROS. So let's just look here at some information about Mauritania. It indicates that this spelling, you have this first spelling with the E, and then you have this variant with the I. It indicates here ancient country in northern Africa, west of Numidia, in modern Morocco and western Algeria. So in other words, the place that we understand as ancient Mauritania is or was in the place that we now understand as modern Morocco. And so therefore there would be a connection between Mauritania and Morocco. But again, both of these names have the Moor construct in them. And so they are both coming from this Latin Greek root. And here we see a variation of the Moreno with the Moreno coming out of Spain. And this name is related to a number of entities in that region who were considered noble families. And so this was a noble clan. And here we see the direct translation out of the Spanish into the English for both the Morena and the Moreno. And of course, both of these translating as brunette. And of course, the origin of brunette is brown. And of course, some people insinuate that this is just referring to having brown hair. Okay, if you want to. With respect to this brown dynamic, the majority of people on the earth are some variation of brown, whether they are classifying themselves as black or they are classifying themselves as white. All you need to do is go to a makeup counter. You go to a makeup counter and you look at the varying shades that are available for people, whether they are classifying themselves as black or white. And what you are going to find are these varying shades of brown. Some of them are creamy looking, some of them are chocolate looking, and some of them are all of those things in between. However, they are all shades of brown. Some of them more pinkish and some of them more chocolatey. However, all shades of brown. This is why all of these insinuations about black and brown people are quite ridiculous, because the entities that are referred to as black are actually brown, and the entities that tend to be referred to as brown are simply a lighter shade of brown. And of course, what goes along with that is entities identifying as white are again simply another shade of brown. Now let's quickly look at this Maori. That's the root of Mauritania here in terms of surnames. Maori also comes out of Italy. It indicates here the surname Maori, Mori, is from the personal name Mauro, which is itself derived from the Latin name Maurus. Again, so this Maori that's coming out of Italy is coming from this Maurus or Moros, coming from the Greek and the Latin. And here you see that translation coming out of the Greek with that Mavro, that Maru, going into the Hebrew, and you see the same dynamic. And so Maru, Mavro, coming out of the Greek into the Hebrew is Shakur, which is black. Now, one of the reasons why there is so much confusion about these histories, and you have these odd individuals going into museums right now and libraries trying to change things around, is because there is a caste system that has been created, and people have purchased this caste system. They bought into it, hook, line, and sinker. And so this caste system indicates that some people on one side of the caste are identified with the word white, and then you have people on the other side of the caste who are identified with the word black. And people have actually taken this up and run with it. So you have people being proud of being on one side of the caste system or the other, regardless of what their phenotypes actually happen to be or what their ancestors actually happen to be. And again, you see this pride on both sides related to a phenotype. And I'm just going to say, if your greatest pride in life is your skin color, I don't care if it's dark or light, if that's your greatest pride in life, you need to get a life. So, moving back to this whole situation with this skin color, many individuals either align with these identities or distance themselves from the identities based upon either what they've been told about themselves or what it is they believe is going to be beneficial to them. And so, if individuals believe that being in one caste or another is going to come with certain benefits, they will cling on to that caste, identify wholeheartedly, with these caste systems. And this just goes to show the narcissism that is a part of these caste systems. And so, when you hear individuals bragging about being identified as white or being identified as black, and going on with these narratives about how great they are and how great their ancestors are, just because they were white or black in these caste systems. These entities are narcissistic. And what they are hoping to tap into is your narcissism. And so when individuals are talking about what's popping, again, with respect to their phenotype, you know that something is going on with those entities. Now, for some individuals, part of this is coming from a reaction from a history of rejection based upon these caste systems. But it really is okay to just acknowledge that and move on versus embracing these caste systems wholeheartedly and getting upset, quite frankly, when other people don't embrace the caste systems. Now, let me say this to people who are identifying as black and white. They've got white pride, they've got black pride. Let me tell you, there is no nation in this world right now that is the nation of white or the nation of black. Now, of course, you might say Niger or Niger or Albania or something like that. However, with respect to the English words black and white that we use right now, there are no countries with this name, with these names that have been constructed. And so identifying with these names and these caste systems, these do not provide you with a sense of continuity in terms of ancestry. And so the question is, what is your ancestry? Where are you actually coming from? And based upon history, we know that these ancestries are a bit muddy, don't we? Because when there is colonization and imperialism taking place, part of the process is muddying the water, contaminating the water, removing people, transferring people, all of that interesting stuff that has taken place that makes the ancestries muddy. And so many people are simply delusional, and they are so caught up in these narratives about skin color and about phenotypes that they cannot see straight. We have entire governmental entities making policy based upon caste systems which they insist don't exist. And part of this, again, is coming from many people are just looking for privilege. People want to be in the VIP section in life. And when people are in the VIP section in life, they want to have some sort of exclusivity, and that makes them feel good. And so it doesn't matter whether we're talking about people who are identifying as white or black, or definitely people who are identifying under that Abraham umbrella. Many people get their sense of significance by being treated better than other people, because this makes them believe in their fantasy world that they are better than other people simply because people look different from them. hmm And note that this does not in any way indicate that all of the brown people in the Americas are descended from Abraham or from Isaac or Jacob. And here you have this Mavro coming out of the Greek into the English as black. And here, of course, we see the Morisco history coming out of Italy. And of course, noble is another way of saying lesser royalty. It indicates here that this Morisco name is coming from the personal name of Mauro, which of course is coming from the Latin for Morus or Maurus. And here you see that Mauru being Latvian detected, translating into the English as Moorish. It is also observed that there is a conflation between Moorish and Arab. Now, in some instances, these entities are seen as distinct. However, when looking at some of the narratives about the history of Maria, you see that many of these entities appear to be coming out of the Levant area, to be coming out of the Western Asia area. And of course, as you should recall, the word Arab means a number of things, but one of the things that Arab means in terms of translation related to the Hebrew specifically is this idea of night or evening or darkening. And so there is this construct of something being darkened in relation to the word Arab. And here we have a relevant contribution from the Jewish Virtual Library on this topic. It indicates here there were Jews living in Mauritania located between Senegal, Western Sahara, and the North Atlantic Ocean as early as the fall of the biblical Jewish state when the temple was destroyed in 70 BCE. At that point, many Jews spread throughout the Roman Empire, including the province of Mauritania. Divided into groups that paid taxes to the Romans, they raised cattle, farmed, and traded. Under the Romans and the Vandals, the Jews of Mauritania flourished. And here is this indication that there has been a long-standing relationship between what would be considered Jacob and Mauritania, such that many who have been identified as Jacob related to the colonization dynamic, many of these entities are integrated in such a way that they are understood as the Maori. The other thing that stands out is that place called Negro land was around this area. It appeared and then it disappeared. It's important to keep in mind also that that word Negro is not an English word. That's not where it came from. And so this idea of Negro was definitely referring to these entities that were collectively traveling and existing together. And so that would be Jacob and the Moors. Now, there's also an indication that there is so much conflation going on that Jacob and the Moors might be one and the same. And of course, these Mauritanians or these Moroccans were involved in significant trade and commerce. Now, there are varying narratives going on related to the destinations of these entities when they left out of Spain and Portugal. For some of them, there was a colonization endeavor. For some others, it appears that they might have perhaps gotten caught up as victims in the transatlantic slave trade. And so there are varying dynamics going on here with respect to this collective of people that we now see are really the Moors. And so when we see Mauritania, we see the Moors regardless of what religious tradition they might happen to have been following. And also, of course, this plays a part in what happened with the superimposition of the Negro identity and the Moor identity onto many of the indigenous people of the Americas. And so much of this was a part of the migration and the colonization, and again, that imposition of identity onto people. Some of this imposition was also going on with respect to that lower part of West Africa. And so there are a number of dynamics that have taken place that have been very, very confusing. However, this sheds some light on some of those dynamics related to the Moriscos and the Moranos. Another correlation that ties the Moriscos and Moranos together is the Hebrew dynamic related to those letters that we've looked at before. And so that construct of Mem and Resh, and also Aleph. And so you even see that that's basically the name Moor when you put it all together, or Maur when you put it together, and then that Amur and Amur. And you see this common thread running throughout both of these traditions with these entities. And you also see some manifestations of this in certain parts of Europe and Asia. And so you see that Amur River, so you see things like that. And then, of course, there are these clans that we've talked about before related to Afghanistan and the ancient Maori clans. We've also looked at them with respect to Iran. Okay, now we're going to take a quick look at this analytical concordance, and this was published in 1910, but it also gives some indications related to the dynamics of the Moriscos and the Moranos. There's also a heavy focus on a confederacy with respect to the Moriscos and the Moranos. And so what you see with respect to these two entities that, as we see, are actually one entity, is a heavy focus on treaties and confederacies and making all of these covenants. And so there is a heavy focus on covenants. Now we see the manifestation of this with respect to American history and these dynamics of getting indigenous people to enter into these treaties, these covenants, these confederacies. Even when you look at the wampum belt, it's very interesting because it very much looks like it is a Morisco and Morano artifact. So if you look at it very closely, you will see exactly what I am talking about. And so again, you see this dynamic of confederacy and covenant with respect to the relationship between these two groups that appear to be one group. And of course, we've talked about this before also, that this is another construct that is tied to this idea of confederacy and covenant and in league. And so you will see these artifacts, these cultural artifacts, speaking to this Hebrew tradition. Now, many people take some of this to mean that the American Indians were Hebrew, or that the people on the west coast of Africa were Hebrew. However, because you have the colonial dynamic going on, you have the entities that are under the Seth, Shem, Hebrew narrative actually colonizing the Americas and Africa. And so therefore, it's not possible to really disentangle things and to assume because you see these artifacts in America or you see these cultural artifacts in Africa, it doesn't mean that those people are the original Hebrew people, Shem people, Seth people. it speaks to the fact that there has been an imposition of culture onto these various people through the colonization process. Because remember, we've talked about this before also, the Moriscos and Marranos were not only deported, but they were dispatched. And so they serve as as they sometimes refer to it, the Moors, as the vanguard. And so they were the first ones to go forth with the colonization dynamic. And what's also interesting is that there's sort of a loss of memory about how all of this works. And so there are all of these assertions that the American Indians were them. What has happened is that when you start to conquer people and you intermarry with people and you impose your identity onto people, yes, they do become the people that have colonized them. And I'm talking about in terms of ancestry. And so it's kind of hard to get around that. And so you are going to see all of these manifestations, these Hebrew, Shem, Seth manifestations on the west coast of Africa. You're going to see these manifestations throughout both North America and South America. This doesn't mean that the indigenous people, however, were these people. It means that these people integrated with the indigenous people, and so therefore the descendants would be both entities. And so you would have these present day entities who identify as American Indian, for instance. Those present day entities that identify as American Indian might also simultaneously be Hebrew or Morisco or Marrano descended. And so that's something that's important to keep in mind. And sometimes people are trying to create this fiction about purity. And so therefore, once they identify with one thing or the other, they, just forget about all of these other ancestors. And so if someone is American Indian simply because they have been creolized with another entity, it doesn't mean that they are no longer American Indian. However, it does mean that they are a part of all of these other entities. And so it's probably not a good idea to just pretend that these other ancestral lines don't exist. It's not necessary, and so it doesn't take away from anyone's family side. And so just because you have another side of a family doesn't mean that you don't belong to the other side of the family. So you belong to both. And many people are attempting to avoid that right now, and historically that has been the case. And of course, a part of this has been this superimposition wherein the identities of the indigenous people have been transformed. And part of that transformation was this superimposition. And so the superimposition of religion, the imposition of patriarchy, because when we're talking about the Hebrew, Shem, Seth dynamic, we are talking about significant patriarchy, and we are talking about a patriarchy that attacked and supplanted the matrilineal dynamics. And so a big part of the conflict with the colonization process was really aimed at the indigenous women. And so that was the major conquest. That's where the land was taken. And so that's the big conflict. It's the colonizer males versus, if you will, the indigenous females. And it's the same thing on the west coast of Africa. It's possible that it's very similar in Australia, in India, New Zealand, various places where you saw this Hebrew, Shem, Seth heritage being placed onto people, and these matrilineal clans and nations and tribes around the world. And so there was a significant loss of identity simply because of that dynamic. And so keep that in mind. Even when you see these dynamics, like you have these Confederate states even in the Americas or these Indian confederacies, those were not the indigenous women creating these things. Those were colonial dynamics, those are colonial constructs. In fact, that's not to say that indigenous people didn't have relationships and agreements, but this whole formalized dynamic related to these covenants, this is a part of colonization. And if you look at the entities doing the colonizing, you see that covenant is at the core of the dynamic. And so it's at the core of the history, it's at the core of the religious narratives. And here you see this word kashar, which also refers to this idea of confederacy, but also conspiracy and treason. And so there are some interesting dynamics that go on with this whole covenant idea, and we've looked at some of that before. What's also interesting is in terms of the etymology chain, is the word that comes next after this kashar, and it is the bow and the archer. And here you can see this idea of confederacy a little bit better here. And so it is this idea of binding and tying and making a league. And if you look at those indigenous treaties, you can see that what is going on in the treaties is this binding, making indigenous people bound to the entities that were engaged in the imperial endeavor. And so making them almost inseparable in many ways. And so that's why it's difficult to create those lines of demarcation that need to be there with respect to these two entities. And so we are not talking about the same entities. And you can see that with this superimposition of all of these treaties and these covenants. Okay. So there's a joining together. Okay, so there's a knitting them together, and that's what those treaties are all about. And so the treaties really, if you look at the treaties, it really takes away the identity of the indigenous people. That's a part of the treaties. The treaties insisted upon, even though there were words that would suggest otherwise, there was the insistence that the indigenous people become less indigenous and become more European. Now, when there was the Africanizing of the indigenous people, there was a pushing onto the indigenous people in the Americas of the African identity. And so there have been multiple efforts to create these bonds between indigenous people and other collectives. And you'll even see entities that identify as Moorish pushing the Asiatic dynamic onto the indigenous people. And so there are a lot of dynamics going on here, and the Moriscos and the Moranos are definitely integral to the entire dynamic, and we've talked about that before. Now, we're not going to go into this relationship between these two constructs related to this confederacy and this bow and this archer. However, one thing that is tying them together in terms of etymology is this idea of straw. Now, this is a good time to draw that connection between the Morisco and Marrano dynamic and this open letter from Queen Elizabeth I back in the 1500s to all of these mayors of England. And so what she was doing was making a deportation request. And the deportation request was related to the Negars and blackamoors. And so you can see there that they are seen in many ways as one and the same. They are bound together as one entity in many instances, and this is one of those instances. One thing does stand out, however, there is great difficulty all of a sudden with finding the original documents that were readily available previously. And so we see this notation in this Johns Hopkins article, wherein it indicates finally in 1601 she complained about the great numbers of Negars and blackamoors which are crept into this realm. Now, there might be an attempt going on to rewrite history in England at this present time, and so that might account for some of the difficulty. There were articles and all sorts of resources available through the National Archive years ago. However, they changed that whole format, and many of the things that appear to be available do not appear to be available in current times. And here you have this author actually citing this other source other than this actual draft. And so there is something interesting going on with respect to sources and resources that previously were available. And so that's one of the other reasons to make sure that you have hard copies of things that you think are important. This also provides some food for thought regarding what has taken place with the indigenous people of America. There are a number of dynamics going on and that have taken place related to creating these caste systems for indigenous people. And again, many indigenous people have purchased this entire package. And so this is food for thought for all individuals, regardless of where they are coming from, what their phenotype happens to be, because if you go into various countries, you will find that people find ways to divide themselves. People find ways to create hierarchies. People are obsessed with hierarchies. People are obsessed with narcissistic inclinations, and it's very difficult to shake people loose from their narcissistic inclinations. But narcissism is a very dangerous thing when it goes too far, and we see the manifestations of that going on right now with these various power hungry entities that we are dealing with around the world. And thank you to those of you who have been contributing your own research, your own insights and reflections and understandings related to these various topics. We might not have the entire puzzle put together, but we do have pieces of this puzzle, and hopefully these pieces will start to fit together in such a way that we won't just have facts, but we will be closer to the truth.